my mic working? Yes, awesome, cool. It's great to see all of you. When Josh called me a couple months ago, or I think he just texted me and said, "Hey, can you give a talk about the history of civilization and cryptography in the next several thousand years?" I said no, but as many of you who have ever said no to Josh, you then get the call and then you end up saying yes to Josh. So here we are. So as he said, I'm Alexander Rose. I'm the director at the Long Now Foundation, and I've been working on basically kind of figuring out kind of threads of history and stories over the last 10,000 years and the next 10,000 years, and how those stories really have kept organizations and institutions alive. And we ourselves are trying to create a very long-term institution, and I think the interesting thing about this story of cryptography and ledgers and even language is that this is a thread that has really kind of moved both wars and merchants through all of time. So bear with me. I'm going to give you a bit of history of both cryptography and language, and I make sure that I will tie it up at the end to something that will hopefully set us on our way today. The title of this talk is called Confusion of Tongues, and this comes from the story of Genesis. After the Great Flood and Noah's Ark, there was this time in biblical history where everyone spoke the same language, and they started building the Tower of Babel all the way up to heaven. And God said, "I don't like this. I don't want you this close to heaven. Cast the tower down and cast the people around the world." And they were each speaking a different language, and they could no longer coordinate to build a tower to heaven for the rest of human history. Now, many cultures have stories like this, but I think it's an interesting place to start in that really the first cryptography was language itself. And we even see it in acronyms. We see it even in colloquialisms. Even there's a Boontling language in Boonville, just north of here, that's really about kind of keeping the locals knowing what's going on and the non-locals from not knowing what's going on. But if we look at the more scientific version of the story of Babel, we have languages, over 7,500 languages in the world that we know of, and about 2,000 or 3,000 of them currently on Earth. That happened by, obviously, a very slow 65,000-year diaspora around the world, plus the millions of years before that in Africa. And this first version of cryptography as language has been used as recently in wartime as World War I with the Choctaw Telephone Squad, and more famously the Navajo Code Talkers in World War II. They were using Navajo language, a very small number of speakers of that language to speak, and they still spoke in code, but the thought was even if the Axis powers were able to decode the code itself, then they would have to now know Navajo. And that was pretty hard for the Axis powers around that time. And then we see also in language, places like this. This is Papua New Guinea. This is a language map of Papua New Guinea. About 20% of the world's language diversity is just in this region of the world, and they also use language as a type of cryptography, in that they have a public language that they speak to do trade. They have a private tribal language, and then they have often a magic language that's used to kind of keep the magic safe within that tribe. And so this use of language as cryptography is something that we're going to kind of see through history that I'll show. And as more and more parts of civilization can speak the same language or write the same language, that's when cryptography has to happen, because people want to do effectively arbitrage, right? They want to know the price of a thing in one end of the world, know what they can sell it for on the other end of the world, or the other place that we see a lot of cryptography is obviously in wartime. And so in fact, the very first writing system that we know, cuneiform, was used to write the values of commodities in Sumeria, and this is about 5,500 years ago. And then the very first written cryptography that we know about was in ancient Egypt, about 1,000 years later, with these hieroglyphs. There was transposed hieroglyphs in here because at this time the more of the masses were learning hieroglyphs, and the kind of elite class wanted to hold information away from them, so they were already doing a kind of a transposition cryptography in hieroglyphs. Fast forward another couple thousand years, this is the skittily. This is probably the first physical cipher machine that we know about. And so a written papyrus message would be written, and then you'd wrap it up, you'd put it on this stick, and you'd wrap the leather around it, and you'd get your transposition cipher from that. And this was used through up in about the 7th century BC, all the way up into Sparta, was using it for wartime communications. Julius Caesar used this by about the turn of the millennium into AD. This is a little diagram here on the right of how this, and this is also when additive substitution ciphers started, which is a little bit more advanced than the original, than the ones that we were seeing before. And sadly, while Julius Caesar was able to use this to send encrypted information, clearly Brutus was able to also send encrypted information to the demise of Julius. The interesting thing, like all great stories of the history of technology or invention, we often think of the first white people who did it. Of course, as many of these stories go, that's not really how it went. In about 850 AD, Al-Kindi wrote a treatise on cryptanalysis in the Islamic world. And that went all the way up into the 14th century when, as far as we know, it was lost and had to be reinvented in Europe. Around the time of the Renaissance, which is where we're getting to today, right? And this idea of cryptography and arbitrage, which I know is going to be a pretty important topic for what we're talking about today, just keeps coming up throughout history. And it was happening in the Islamic world when the Islamic world was trying to trade, and they wanted to keep the price of a purchase to a sale secret between a vast distance, but be able to send that through messengers that they may or may not trust. Before that time, the trust agents that we now call ledgers were human beings, and they were familial ties. So like when you were sending something in the Silk Road from China to Europe, all the stations along that way were trusted family members and merchants that had long-time relationships, so that each time that passed from one person to another, that they could trade the value of something and keep it secret. But there was obviously a lot of holes in that system, and that's why cryptography was really needed for that. And as we get into the Middle Ages, this really horrible thing happened called the Black Plague. It's considered about 50% of the world population at the time went down to this in the span of literally only about a decade, in 1340 to 53. And this is also, incidentally, where passports were invented. The very first passports that we know of were actually they're your health status document. So it's always interesting to me when people get all huffy about passports for health. That's actually what they were invented for around the Black Plague. And so as the Black Plague finally burned its way through Europe, this is when what we now call the historic Renaissance. And as people were re-emerging back onto the scene, and trade really started coming across the world, and it was happening by boat, by land. This is when a new form of cryptography really had to be invented, so that information could get pushed from one end of the known world to the other and only be decrypted by the people that they wanted to. And so the person who invented that, which is an Italian named Alberti, and he invented the polyalphabetic cipher, which is kind of like the Captain Crunch decoder ring, where you can, if each side has it, and it's a little bit more advanced than the kind of cryptography that we had with the skittily. That was later built on by the French cryptographer Vigenère and the Vigenère square, which adds another axis to the whole encryption process, making it much more difficult. And this actually is pretty close to what we get into all the way up into the 20th century types of cryptography. And the other thing that happened right around this time that is the conversation that I had with Josh, that was a thread that I had not really picked up on, is that at that time, a whole new ledger system, it was the time where a new ledger system was invented, and the ledger system was double entry accounting. So basically, it's the way that you still use QuickBooks. This is the way that QuickBooks works, or any accounting system that you have an entry for an input and an output. And what this did that was really important was that it helped decentralize trade. And it allowed for a decentralized organization to use a ledger that everybody understood and make that work. And the Medici family, who was really a large crime syndicate of a bunch of criminal activity originally, they used this as a way to keep track of all of their various economic doings. And then later, they became one of the largest banking families, but they didn't invent the double entry accounting, but they were the ones who used it most effectively early on and started putting it out there. So this is the first ledger system, and as we know, how ledgers work is, it used to be with people. This started to become a non-people-based ledger, and just like that, just as that went from people to a more mechanized system, so did computation. Right? And so computation was originally computers were people, and they would compute things. But then, as we get into the age of the kind of mid-1800s, you have Charles Babbage building fairly complex mechanical computers, and was a good mathematician himself. And he actually invented, as far as we know, or at least discovered, the statistical analysis method to attack the Vigenère square. And that's both those things are still in use today in a way, and up until the most modern cryptography. And he was actually using this during the Crimean War. He didn't document it very well, and so because it was during wartime, I think he didn't want that secret to get out. So Kasiski was the one who we often credit with figuring out this method of attacking the Vigenère square. And so now you have this problem of your cryptography not really working very well, right? And that problem had to be solved as we get into the modern era, as computers started getting better and better. That's how we started doing much deeper encryption that way. And then we get into the modern era, right? So the modern era is another pandemic. It's clearly not half the world population, we hope, is going to be affected by this, but we are here, and we've definitely been in a lockdown similar to the time of the Black Plague, and we are emerging from it. And we also have a new ledger system, just like they did coming out of the Renaissance. But this ledger system makes it so that the trust agents don't have to be people, again, moving from people to non-people-based systems, and that's the blockchain. So we have the blockchain that allows us to have a distributed ledger system that everybody trusts, and that a thing happened at a certain time. And then, of course, currencies have been built on this system, and new forms of arbitrage, and that's why you guys are all here today. And so, as I said, I'll wrap this all the way up into the present moment, and also think a little bit about the future. I think it's worth thinking about what is going to happen next. If we're building a system that might be in place for hundreds of years or 1,000 years, do we think that? I don't know. This is a picture of one of the most advanced computers in the world, which I think is hilarious, what that looks like now. It looks like something from the original Dune movie. But it's a quantum computer, and it seems like there's at least an arguable position that quantum computing may both break modern cryptography and have to create a new form of cryptography, and there's going to be a time in between, just like there was in the past, where cryptography is out of sync with the information. And I think it's just worth us all thinking about that deep future of cryptography, ledgers, and how it affects society and arbitrage and war as we move forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.